make one similar to theirs so they'll accept it. Again, it's a money-making thing, and I just don't see why you need it. If you read it, it's not much different than the King James Version of the Scripture, but it's not as good as the King James Version of the Scripture, and so you can throw it out with the rest of the garbage. Traditional text. Byzantine text. I didn't mean to be unkind about that. I don't know what you do with a Bible that's flawed. The same thing that was done with the Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. You put it somewhere and leave it just because you don't know what to do with it. In the 1400s, the Waldensians would have used and would have put out the copies, or they would have used the majority text. And of course, we would have there some information about Germany. Luther and as well as Calvin would have made translations from the Textus Receptus. The Greek text editions in 1516, of course, what would be around 1516 as contemporary with that? What would be the great development in the 1500s?
Spanish Inquisition.
The New World.
Spanish Inquisition. What about printing?
Oh,
Gutenberg.
Yeah, the printing press. And so why would there be editions of the Scripture largely circulated in the 1500s? Well, printing press. Erasmus would have been the first to print Greek New Testament, and he would have, people really beat up on Erasmus. Maybe we'll get time to defend him just a little bit, but he would have, can I say this kindly? He wouldn't have been ignorant of things we know today. And what people say is, well, Erasmus just used the Bible they'd always used, and he didn't know anything, didn't research anything. Read the writings of Erasmus. He was aware of the Vaticanus. He was aware of the Sinaiticus. And like the church always had done, he rejected those texts. Why? Because of the doctrinal error that was in them. Stephanus would have succeeded Erasmus, and he would have made a new version or new printing. Pastor, why are these men all changing? Why wouldn't Erasmus' version be the same? Well, the types of letters in the Greek that were printed, as in, if you take my Greek New Testament, you'll see that it's written all in lowercase, and which would be much easier for printing purposes. And do you think that every printing is perfect at the first time? Try doing a church bulletin on Sunday morning sometime without mistakes. And I don't think I've ever had one. I might have, but whenever I think I do, somebody always points out something that I missed or I forgot or should have been there. And in printing, there are mistakes. What's the great thing about that? Well, the great thing about it is that the priesthood has always been there to recognize the problems and be able to fix it. Hey, did you know that the 1611 version of the King James Version is not the version that you use and that you have? We have the 1769. Did you know that there was a 1611, 1612, 1613? There's a page from the 1613 right there. Why would they why would they keep making new versions of it? Well, printing errors, misspellings, that sort of thing. But what I want to point out to you is that the Bible was never lost in that transition period. The mistakes, when they were seen, were everybody was able to say, yes, that's an error. And so they were able to correct those things. It was not that the truth was lost. Okay, then there were English translations that we came from. In 1526, Tyndale came up with the first translation. Of course, Tyndale would have leaned heavily on the Western text because he would have been influenced heavily by his ability to read Latin. But he was not ignorant of the Greek text, and he did not claim that the Vulgate would have been the better text of the Scripture. And then an individual succeeded Tyndale. Tyndale, of course, was killed for, wasn't he put to death? Yeah, he was put to death for trying to translate the Scripture. And then the Coverdale Bible. And from the Coverdale Bible, there's a lot of English history here as well, came the Great Bible. And then the Geneva Bible. Now, the Geneva Bible would have been the text of the Scripture that when the Pilgrims would have come to America, that would have been the Bible that they would have been holding to. And they would have rejected the 1611, believe it or not. If you study church history and you look at the history of the English Bible, and the reason for it was that it bothered them that there was a new edition of the Bible when their whole lives they've been using the Geneva Bible. What's the problem with that? Well, really isn't a problem with it. The Geneva Bible is actually a good version of the Scripture and just about identical to the King James Version of the Scripture, with the exception that the King James Version would be just a little better translation as far as readability and all that. By the way, the church came to use the King James Version of the Scripture. I don't have a lot of time to look at that today, but I want to point out to you that Christians have never liked their Bible being tampered with, ever. Listen, for no other reason than the fact that I got saved from this book, and I began to memorize it, and God changed my life, and this book is my friend. I don't want it messed with. And believers are to never like their Bible messed with. Even good versions of the Scripture, like the King James Version, have been rejected by believers simply because of change. And that's legitimate, by the way. That's legitimate. That's not an illegitimate argument. That's the argument that's made against anybody that uses King James Version, though, isn't it? We just don't like change. You're just not open to anything. Well, my friend, I am not very open to change, but there's more to it than that, and that is that the doctrinal heresy of the books that you want to throw my book in the garbage for. You see, it's garbage that you're trying to replace it with, and I just don't want that, and I don't think you do either. King James Version, 1611, etc., is what we use today. The Western text, this would be the Latin text, and of course the Roman Catholic Bible, the Roman Catholic Church would have been the source of the Western text. And Jerome would have written the Latin Vulgate, and that would have been widely used. By believers? Was the Vulgate used by believers? Anybody know the answer to that question?
No.
Chris, no. Why not?
Well, it was one, the Catholic Church didn't let anybody look at the Bible.
You weren't allowed to read the Bible. That was Catholic doctrine.
And two, the real believers rejected it.
Real believers rejected it. Give me a third reason. Most people couldn't even read Latin. And so here's a Bible version that the people can't read in their language. And so it was never used by believers. And again, I'll make a statement that I want to apologize and that is that the Catholic Church has never been comprised with believers. It's always been full of doctrinal error and heresy. I know that there are individuals that attack the King James Version. They're going to point some things out, and we'll discuss those. Not this week. We don't have time. It also has some deletions from the traditional text, Western omissions, such as the atonement and the ascension, some verses we looked at this 2 weeks ago in our church service. And we looked at how that those same verses of the Scripture were included in the early church writings. Moving on. Textual criticism. Here are some key players. So we looked at the origin of the text. There is a lot more to it than this, folks. In a quick Sunday school class, all you can do is summarize the history of it. I can give you the books. I can help you if you want to study it out. But this is the origin. Those were the origins of it. Textual criticism. Who are the key players of textual criticism? Well, this gentleman who was in the early 1800s, a young man at that time by the name of Friedrich Constantin von Tischendorf, and we'll from hereafter refer to him as Tischendorf. He was a German rationalism critic who began to search for the Old Testament manuscripts on the assumption that the original form and currently used version of the New Testament had been lost. Okay, so here's an individual that spent his life searching for lost text of the Scripture on the assumption that the Bible didn't exist, that we didn't have it. I don't like his premise. Do you understand what I'm saying? This man is not coming from where you and I come from, that the Bible has been miraculously preserved. This man is coming from the premise that the Bible has not been preserved, it's been lost, and he's going to do civilization and the church the favor of finding it. And so he set off on his journey to find old text, and he's going to discover text of the Scripture. Well, he was traveling, and he went to a Greek Orthodox convent, and this would be a place where the monks would have been. And in 1844, he found the Sinaiticus, and it was very, very, in a trash can were some parchments that were getting ready to be burned, and he discovered them. He said, wow, these things are old. And he believed, Tischendorf believed, that these would have been the actual parchments that Constantine would have ordered written to be taken to Constantinople. And so would have been, of course, very old, back in the AD 300s, that these would have been written, already 1,500 years old at the time of Tischendorf. And so he discovers these, and the monks saw him discover these, and they said, give me that. And so because of his interest in them, they came to the realization that these things must be valuable, and they said, you get out of here. And they held on to it, wouldn't let him look at it. And they had the rest of the text, so they put it back together. And so the Sinaiticus came from the garbage. The monks were burning it. That's where the origin of the Sinaiticus, or the discovery of it. It wasn't lost. It was in, of course, it was in the Roman Catholic Church. And so it wasn't in the Vatican, but it was been in a monastery. Well, in 1853, 9 years later, he returned again to look at it, and they denied him access. They wouldn't let him. He wanted to go back and copy it, and they said, whoops, I went ahead. And he wasn't allowed. And then in 1856, he returned. And in 1882, though, he came, and he was able to offer this monastery, the leader of the monastery, he promised them that they were going to have great notoriety